Thank you, Helen, and thank you, members, for inviting me. Usually one tries to start a meeting with a talk with a joke or a story or an event that might give one some sense of what's going to happen. My first meeting as chairman of the Board of Ethics was Wednesday, this Wednesday, and the meeting was canceled due to a lack of quorum. 3 of the 5 members were out of action due to COVID-related reasons. And I'm hoping this is not going to be emblematic of my term as chairman of the Board of Ethics. I just want to say that I was solicited to be the chairman, or to be on this committee by Nan Sumner Mack, a former member. And then I volunteered because I thought that my professional experience in education in ethics would have something, so that I would have something to contribute to the Board of Ethics. And that has turned out to be both a boon and a frustration. The ethics committees like this, there was in the early 1980s, I think in reaction to the Nixon phenomena, ethics committees were generated throughout the country. Some of you may remember Senator Frank Church from Idaho was a senator who led a committee for reforms after the whole Watergate experience. And one of the throw-offs or spin-offs of that was the creation of ethics boards and committees at all levels of government. And as we're seeing now, many of those boards have inspector generals. That whole phenomena was created out of that movement in the 1980s. And many of those have been just pushed by the wayside in the last 4 to 6 years. Our board, well, one other thing I would say about that is it's interesting that, of course, who created these boards, it was primarily politicians and lawyers. And so that the boards that were created, and in the last 40 years of their development, have all become sort of quasi-judicial boards, or to put it another way, a poor man's quasi-court. We are, it seems to me, from my perspective, that we are the model is the legal model, and it's and anybody who really thinks about ethics realizes that ethics and morality is wider than the topic of law, and so the model is kind of a misfit. The requirements of morality and ethics are much broader and more extensive than the requirements of the law. That's a very interesting, that was sort of the first bit of education. I didn't quite realize that the Board of Ethics would be basically sort of an informal legal court model. Now, it was interesting. Some of you may know Jay Yoshimoto. He was the deputy corporation counsel who did my initial training and introduced me to the Board of Ethics for the county. And he impressed upon me that the board is the body that interprets the ethics, the county ethics board, and no one else else, and that's also what the code means. The board tells us what the code means. He was at that point our legal counsel for the board to keep us out of legal trouble. And I find it very important to understand what the purpose or function of the board is. And I want to just read to you from the Article 14 of the Code of Ethics of the county charter, on the Code of Ethics about the county charter. Under the section of enactment of a Board of Ethics policy, it says, elected and appointed officers and employees shall demonstrate the highest standard of ethical conduct so that the public may have trust and confidence in the integrity of government. And the Board of Ethics is to help be the mechanism which will ensure that the people of the county of Hawaii will have confidence in the moral standards and quality of their elected officials and any appointed officials, anyone who serves the county of Hawaii. And that includes employees, members of the voluntary boards, and so on. One of the things that I noticed, and it struck me as a bit of an anomaly right from the get-go, is when I raised my hand and took an oath of office as a volunteer. And that oath of office was very standard boilerplate that I swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution and the laws of the state of Hawaii. Period. Full stop. It didn't say anything about upholding the laws of the county of Hawaii or the Code of Ethics of the county of Hawaii. So that it struck me as that's needed to be added. And I've been trying for 2 years to add and the charter and code of ethics of the county and laws of the county of Hawaii. But there are things like that that are rather striking that I have found. And for 2 years, or 3 years actually, I could say that I have been in a struggle with the way things have been done in the past and the understanding by the Corporation Counsel and the Deputy Corporation Counsel who gives us advice with what our role is and how broad it is. What are the parameters of what we're to be doing? And this has been a very interesting experience. Maybe the way I'm describing it makes it sound like this is a very onerous, terrible thing, but to a philosopher, this is very interesting and challenging and keeps me, it's more interesting than the golf I'm doing with Helen's husband. But
Hi, Nina.
so I began, I like to think of it as sort of my position began with sort of a baptism of fire. When I first got on the board, who appeared before the board but Mitch Roth, the county prosecutor, our current mayor. And he came voluntarily to the committee, initiating an interaction with the ethics board. He wanted the ethics board's opinion about the following. At that point, there had just been 31 arrests on the Mauna Kea access road because of a protest that blocked the road and kept the construction of the TMT, the telescope. And he was being criticized that he could not prosecute those cases because he had a conflict of interest. And there were groups forming and raising objections and pointing out to him that he was in a conflict of interest and also an appearance of a conflict of interest. And these opinions were being expressed by people throughout the state of Hawaii, and also a law professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and also a law professor at University of Washington in Seattle. And he had recused himself from being the prosecutor in those 31 cases. And he wanted to know if that was necessary. He personally didn't think he needed to recuse himself, but he, out of an abundance of caution, did so. The problem, the conflict of interest that was identified was that his spouse worked for the UH Astronomy Center up by Komohana, and his son worked for NASA on the Mars rover project. So the board received that information, and of course, once Mayor Roth was put on the agenda, or Prosecutor Roth at that time was put on the agenda, the public could speak. And right away, the public certainly did speak by the tens. Many people started attending the ethics board meeting, including protesters. Many people pointed out to the ethics committee and board that we had no jurisdiction and no say in such a matter, that this was a legal matter, this was not an ethics matter. So the education began right then and there. The board, after many months, ended up making a ruling and telling a formal ruling, which has the status of law, that Mayor Roth or Prosecutor Roth did not have a conflict of interest, and was silent on the question of an appearance of a conflict. At that point, there were 5 of us on the board, and I expressed a dissenting opinion. My dissenting opinion was that Mayor Roth did not have a conflict of interest, nor did he have an appearance of a conflict of interest, and that he was totally cleared from all of the objections that people were raising against him. Now, this may seem rather arcane, but what's the difference between having a conflict of interest and an appearance of a conflict of interest? And why did the board only rule, the majority of the board only rule that he didn't have a conflict of interest and was silent on whether he had an appearance of a conflict of interest? Well, one of the things was that those who were criticizing Prosecutor Roth said that even if he didn't have a conflict of interest, it sure appears to us that he does. And he should then recuse himself and be barred from prosecuting these cases. We said that we thought it was advisable to recuse himself just to drop the heat here. But his wife had no decisional capacity. She had in decisions regarding the astronomy and the TMT. His son was working for NASA in Southern California on the Mars rover project, and that has nothing to do with the mountain or Hawaii and the TMT. So I said that he didn't have an appearance of a conflict either. And the law professors at University of Washington and at Manoa and some other faculty members and other protesters were accusing him of all these things. The Corporation Counsel recused himself because of the Corporation Counsel's relationship with the prosecutor's office. And so a Corporation Counsel came from Maui to serve as our advisor. And he said that we had no jurisdiction and no, to make a judgment about appearance of conflict of interest, only conflict of interest, because that's the only thing that was in the ethics code. And that gets at the major issue that I have with the county ethics board, and that is the legal advice from the Corporation Counsel says the only things that the Board of Ethics can deal with are things that are in the county ethics code. And if it's not in the county ethics code, then we cannot talk about it, or it's not our kuleana, as it were. And so I've been in a 3-year struggle saying that ethics is broader than what you can write in a code. And every ethicist that I've read, from Plato on down, points out that it is a confusion and a fundamental mistake to think that law and ethics are the same thing. Ethics deals with much more than the specific things you can lay down in a code. And our own county code, which I think is interesting, in the ethics code, I want to read to you just a part of a sentence. It starts right out with how should the code of ethics be interpreted? And it starts right out by saying, this article shall be liberally construed to promote the highest standards of ethical conduct in government. So liberally construed means they want it to be elastic, not to be nitpicking about this, and this. And yet, when you look at our code, it talks about a conflict of interest, and you only have a conflict of interest if it involved a relative, and then it names types of relatives. So if those types of relatives are not on the list, then you're okay. Well, what if your father isn't on the list or grandfather isn't on the list, but that turns out to be the party that had decisional role? The legal counsel says, well, that's not covered. And I wanted to argue, and this is how it's been with everything I've done on this board, is are we going to liberally and broadly construe or narrowly construe? So that's just a place to start in understanding the sort of baptism by fire that when I started out. The second thing that's connected to it is right away at that same time, those of you who are from Hawaii will know, is that the whole protest and closing of the road was continuing and went on for, well, I guess in some senses still in the air. I think it's a question of when and if there's an effort to resume the TMT, that I think the protectors will be back on the road. But at that same point, the county, the state ethics commission decided to have an educational session. They have them about once a year. And so our contingent went to the Board of Ethics, the State Board of Ethics meeting. And at that meeting, I raised a question. I said, since Governor Ige is the key operating officer, isn't it the case that he has a duty to enforce the laws or uphold the laws of the state of Hawaii? And isn't it against the law for a group of people to block the roads? Is that correct? Well, that was correct. And so I said, well, then if he is failing in his role, isn't that immoral? Didn't he take an oath of office? At this point, I was watching and looking around the room, and I was amazed at how many people found interest in the desks before them. This topic fell stillborn, and it was dropped. It wasn't talked about. The most anyone would say anything is a former, I believe, Senator Giralty said, well, we don't go searching for ethics issues. They are brought to us. So that was that. And so when we got back to Hilo, I kept asking the same question. And then I made the mistake of reading the code that says that the Board of Ethics, matters that come before the Board of Ethics are the following. An employee or officer or volunteer or somebody who's working for the County of Hawaii can ask a question of the board for interpretation. Or a citizen or an employee can raise a complaint and a petition that they believe a fellow employee or a person involved with the ethics, with the county government is violating the code of ethics. And the third category is the Board of Ethics can initiate investigations. So I said, are we failing in our oath that we took if we don't initiate an investigation, basically raise a complaint ourselves about that our mayor or governor or police chief or county prosecutor, somebody is failing in their duties if what you have is the road is closed and it's against the law to close the road. That produced a 2-year struggle that ended with two things. Mr. Joseph Kamehameha, who was corporation counsel at that time, said that this was not our kuleana. We had no role or authority to initiate investigations. He said that despite my reading the section of the code saying that that's one of the things we could do. And then another thing that he said was that if we don't listen to the corporation counsel's advice, he wanted to alert the board to the fact that if we take some action and proceed, that the corporation counsel's office may not defend us in any lawsuits that are generated because we didn't listen to their opinion. We looked at each other a lot and proceeded to initiate opinion anyway. And the opinion was that we have no jurisdiction over the governor. That's the State Ethics Commission. And we wrote them a letter and said, we thought they were remiss that they didn't initiate an investigation. We then wrote up a statement, a judgment that Mayor Kim had failed in his responsibilities because Governor Ige in July of that year, turned the whole mess over to Mayor Kim, who accepted it because of, I think he believed his negotiating skills were going to be adequate to the task. And he then dealt with it for 6 months. And finally, in the end, the whole thing got put on the back burner, I guess. The road is closed, and everybody agreed that there wasn't going to be any building going on for the foreseeable future. And then Mayor Kim's term ended, and the Board of Ethics came to pass that resolution. And the county council's office pointed out that since he's no longer mayor, the whole matter is moot. The clock had run out. And the ethics board had no longer had jurisdiction because he wasn't mayor. Now, we shook our heads too. And we said, we sure do have jurisdiction over past behavior and past failures. And this was one, a failure of the duty to execute. Then the Corporation Council said, where in the Code of Ethics does it say that a officer or employee has a duty to execute? And it isn't in the county code. And on a narrow interpretation of the county code, if it's not, I mean, in the ethics code, and if it's not in the ethics code, then it's not your Kuleana. We declined to, under the leadership of Mr. Robinson, who was our chair, and Judge Wiseman, who just ended, and myself, and Ann Sumner Mack at that time, we voted that the mayor did indeed, unanimously, did indeed violate the Code of Ethics. And why? Because what he did was unfair. It was unequal application of the law, a failure to apply the law equally to everybody. Because by this time there was a petition by members of the community saying that we've tried to drive up the mountain and there are a group of people like us blocking the road. And the police are over there and the road is blocked and we can't go up. And they basically were arguing that this is vigilante justice and this is a failure of the authorities to deal with this. Now, this is much more complicated than I've indicated, as hundreds of people testified. That road, whose road is it? Is this a state road? I mean, it went on, and there were hundreds of people, and I only received one threat. That was it. But this is typical of my experience, which I find very interesting. But I'm giving you this long story because it's a good illustration of what my experience has been, and to this day is, and continuing, to discuss and explore what really is the role of the ethics board. And there are two views: the view of the people who actually formed this thing and the people who are asked to serve on it. And I find it interesting that we've always, in the time that I've been there, we've always had at least two people with legal experience, a retired lawyer, a retired judge. Right now we have a retired judge and a former deputy corporation counsel as members, two real estate agents and a philosopher. That's the makeup of the board. When I first joined the board, it consisted of a judge, an attorney, Mr. Goodnow, and two businessmen. And then I joined the board. So it's been very interesting. And I think I should probably, I don't know, I've been probably talking for more than 15 minutes, but that's part of the problem of asking retired professors to speak. But I'll just mention a few topics and characters and identify a few people so you have an idea of some of the cases we've dealt with. And then if you have questions, I'll answer almost anything. The first, early on, there was a case that involved Ashley Kirkowitz. There was a community complaint about a conflict of interest on her part and a failure to disclose connections. And we have had many cases of questions about proper disclosure. I've already mentioned Mitch Roth. I've already mentioned the Board of Ethics initiation and a big fight with the county corporate council. Another big case was Zendo Kern. Just briefly, who was appointed, and he was a former county councilman. Mayor Roth appointed him to be planning director, and in the 2 years or years since he was on the county council, he basically had a practice in which he advised people who were appealing county plan. He was a planner, and he had over 600 clients who were involved with short-term vacation rentals. All of these issues have been before the planning board, and the question is how much is he going to have to recuse himself? And then there were all kinds of questions of conflict of interest and that, so on. Mr. Rodenhurst, another one that came before the board, and there were challenges by people about his qualifications, but the most interesting part that resulted in an ethics complaint was that Mr. Richards voted for Mr. Rodenhurst's appointment, but he also served as a reference and a recommender for Mr. Rodenhurst to have the position. So some people thought this is two bites at the apple, this is bias, this is conflict of interest, this is a tainted vote, it goes on and on. So that was another interesting case. The Sunshine Law. The Sunshine Law is a very interesting problem. The Sunshine Law, as you know, does not apply to the legislature, but it applies to all other aspects of government, like the Ethics Committee. So whenever we meet, we have to do everything in public, and we have to speak extemporaneously. And so every and scratching of the head makes us look inept and incompetent, because everything's recorded and put in the minutes, and right down to every mispronunciation, every cause instead of because, every, we look like a bunch of klutzes. Use of word klutz is in there. I mean, it's incredible. I was amazed when I read the minutes, and at the next meeting, I considered not speaking. But really, it's amazing, and the amount of things you have to keep in your head all the time. And also, you would have thought that an ethics board would be allowed to be tentative, well, consider this. And then other people exchange and go back and forth, and the result is, boy, that was a bad idea. But now all this is on the record, so you get to be, changing your mind and on and on. So no into it. Did I tell you that yes, I did. One of the things I did was 2 years ago, I proposed that we ought to have in the Code of Ethics a duty to execute as one of the things that is required. Another one that we ought to have is the duty to tell the truth. Turns out that's not in there either. And that we ought to change the oath of office so that it says also that I have a duty to uphold the county code. It goes on. Mr. Van Pernis, there's another exciting case. council member Leloy, the charges against her, and that got very strange and bizarre. I missed some of that, unfortunately. That was a meeting I didn't attend. I think that's probably enough of a list to provoke questions. I think I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Heintz, also known as Larry. We'll clap a minute and we'll have a question or two. Nina, you had a question you wanted to share, correct, Nina? She there?
Yeah, she's there.
No, I don't have a question. I just,
No, not, I'm sorry, Nina Ajima. Nina,
there you go.
go ahead, Nina. I'll read it from the chat line. If the appearance of conflict isn't explicitly in the ethics code and therefore can't be considered, then how can the laws of the County of Hawaii be taken into account by the Ethics Commission to the extent that said laws aren't explicitly set forth as part of the Commission's mandate? And that's a reference, should be to the Board of Ethics. Any comment to that, Larry?
Could you repeat the part? So you're saying, could you repeat that? It's a very
Nina, do
complicated-
you want to ask that question or should I read it again?
You can read it again. I just put.
Okay, if the appearance of conflict isn't explicitly in the ethics code and therefore can't be considered, then how can the laws of the County of Hawaii be taken into account by the Ethics Commission to the extent that said laws aren't explicitly set forth as part of the Commission's mandate? And yes, the reference should probably be to the Board of Ethics.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Dr. Heintz. I finally was able to unmute my button.
Okay, great, thank you.
Struck by your initial comments about how you've been working so diligently for the last couple of years of trying to get very explicit language with respect to your mandate, and then contrast that with the comments of Maui's council that tells you, oh well, you can't consider appearance of impropriety, or I'm sorry, appearance of conflict because it's not in your code. So, how do you reconcile the inconsistency? Thank you.
Well, the way we dealt with that is those of us on the board, some of us said the Corporation Council advises the board. And sometimes if we think the Corporation Council's advice is bad advice, and I said to the Corporation Council, your advice is surely not a liberal construal of our code. And it says our code should be liberally construed. So we disagree with your construal and your restriction that you're putting on us. So we are just going to barge ahead and not abide by what you're saying. In other words, the legal eagles are not the last word. The members of the Board of Ethics are the last word for what we do. And so we basically didn't go along with that interpretation. Because if that interpretation is right, boy, are you hamstrung, as a board. So I think I hope that is responsive to your question.
Thank you. Nancy, you had a question, correct, Nancy?
Yes, I did. You were talking about county employees and governmental employees that are on the County of Hawaii. Does this include the judiciary, or are they separate from this? From the Board of Ethics?
Well, Mitch Roth thought it included him. Okay. Now this is interesting. But what our charter says is any elected official, appointed official, appointee, volunteer. So it also applies to me as a volunteer. I'm a member of any board, okay, and a paid employee. All of us are expected to abide by Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics includes a financial disclosure statement, which I do yearly, and I'm a volunteer, okay? So now, the Joe Camillamella, in his incredibly restrictive interpretation and advice, which the board rejected out of hand, in a 10-page letter, instructed us on what was our kuleana and what wasn't. And he said anything having to do with the police doesn't, you have no jurisdiction over, because there's a police commission. I said to him, a police commission is not an ethics board, and an ethics board deals with the ethical questions, including the ethical behavior of police officers, including the ethical or unethical behavior of judges. So does that answer the question? It sure should, including if the prosecutor or the mayor, any county officer or person. So it doesn't apply to the governor, right? Doesn't apply. So that's the line. That's who's not included. Our charge is to help you, the citizenry, have confidence in the integrity of your governance. And if you think that a member of the court system that's not the state court, but is the county district, is then, if you're supposed to have confidence in them, but the county ethics board doesn't have jurisdiction over unethical behavior of a judge, well, normally what happens is it's true, the judiciary also has a disciplinary body. So Mr. Camillamella said, those disciplinary questions are handled by the police commission or whoever. And he also said, political matters, you don't have anything to do with political matters, it's only ethics. And I thought, gee, that means it doesn't have to do with politicians and political matters. That's taking away almost all of our jobs. I said, who and what is my role? I have nobody to complain about. If he was right.
Yes, it does. It's in this case, it's a circuit court judge in the county of Hawaii. So he would fall under your jurisdiction, correct?
I believe so. But I mean, I'm open to, I guess I haven't, I'm open to being educated. A circuit judge, are they appointed by whom?
They're appointed by Governor Ige.
Okay, so it might well be that he's the disciplinary role there. I don't know. I mean, that would be a very interesting question we'd have to get into.
All I know is that there is a judicial review process.
Yes.
That you can complain to, and that's on the state level.
Okay, so if it's under the state, then it's not us.
Okay, all right. And Charles said circuit court judges are state employees. So
okay, great.
That answers that.
Thank you.
I did have another question. What does it take to revise the Code of Ethics? And maybe this is a long answer, but can you just quantify it into a short answer?
Sure. I can tell you I've been trying for 2 years to get something on the agenda, and it was going to be on the agenda on the 14th, but we didn't have a quorum. So we're continuing to work at it. But here's the real answer. The real answer is, if we want to revise the Code of Ethics, we can revise it and then the county council and send it to the county council, and the county council can vote to approve or not approve it. Okay, so I'm suggesting we add a duty to execute in the code of ethics, and I'm suggesting it also be added into the charter. If we add it to the charter, that requires a referendum by the voters. So what we can do, the Board of Ethics, it's really interesting. It's like one of those Russian dolls with little dolls within dolls within dolls. We have the county charter, we have the code of ethics, and then we have our rules of implementation of our code of ethics. Okay, we have total authority over our rules. We can fix our rules any way we like, and the county council has no say in that. But if we change the ethics code, which was passed by the county council, then our changes have to be passed by the county council. We want to change the charter has to also be approved by the people of the county.
Thank
Okay?
you. And maybe one more question. Michelle, did you have one?
Looks
I
like
think
Margaret.
Margaret,
Or Margaret Drake, did you have a question?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. After 2 years of being our observer to the ethics committee, I haven't had so many laughs for a long time. Thank you, Dr. Heintz.
As long as you're laughing with me, I appreciate. Yeah, we've got to laugh about it and do the best we can. And yes, I think it's valuable and worthwhile. I mean, this is called healthy citizenry.
Thank you very, very much. Given the time of 10:57, 10:58, Margaret, you're going to remain on this Board of Ethics for the League of Women Voters. Is that correct? Yes. And normally we had two persons. Armin resigned. So I know the nominating committee is interested in knowing who might want to serve. And now that you've heard about the Board of Ethics and you know who the chair is, Dr. Larry Heintz, you may want to make sure you submit your name. So Larry, Dr. Heintz, thank you very, very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. And